The basics of how to be a good Mei player. You need to understand the value of all your buttons and how those interact so you can juggle your cooldowns. You need to understand your talent tree, which is it's pretty flexible. Maybe not quite the most flexible of all the tanks, but pretty close. You need to understand Snowblind and that it does more than just blind people. A lot of people don't seem to understand that. You need to understand the Blizzard Icing Engage, which is WE. You need to practice Ice Wall, which I just summarized as Ice Wall angles, but basically get good with Ice Wall. And you need to understand when and when not to Cryo Freeze, which is her trait. So, for auto attacks, you're a ranged tank, which makes you really special because no other tank has range. Blaze, sorta, kinda, little bit, but outside of that, they all have to basically be in melee range. Not true with Mei. Mei has a real ranged auto attack. So, not only does this mean you can poke back on heroes that usually poke at you, but it means you can demount people without using abilities from a distance. This is really, really good in competitive play, where oftentimes fights break out when everyone is mounted. And so being able to do that without using ability gives you an edge up on basically every other tank. Also, your auto attacks actually kind of hurt. By themselves, they're normally just essentially normal melee tank attacks, slightly less. I think the base for Mei is around 74, 75 damage. And then, for example, Murden does 85 per auto. Diablo does 105. But again, they're in melee range, you're ranged. But you have this cool talent, it's called Heat Transfer. And for the most part, what that means is your autos scale really well whenever an enemy hero is slowed, rooted, or stunned. You're going to be doing significantly more. You can see here, at 20, just as an example, 219 per auto. Cassia does 263 per auto. You're doing you're within, throwing distance of hyper carry DPS in terms of AA damage because you took Heat Transfer at 1 and because you have ranged autos. What that also means is because of her abilities and because she's ranged, so you can kind of position without being all in, you can fight 1v1s and 1v2s much better than other tanks because you aren't in a position to get hit by everything for free. For example, when I play Diablo and I charge in, I'm in there for the duration until one side either dies or is able to back out. And as someone with no mobility options, it's probably not going to be me backing out. Mei is different. Mei can essentially hold her own until either icing is back up or until backup arrives. And so you have a lot more options than other tanks in terms of duels. So that's something you can keep in mind compared to other tanks. You don't have to commit to fights, but when you do, you have the tools to stay alive in them a lot longer. Everyone calls Q Snowball, so for the most part, people will get that mixed up with the other 3 or 4 abilities that also could be construed as Snowball, along with the little robot she has, which is named Snowball. But yes, the talent's actually Snowblind, and as the name suggests, you're primarily going to use it to blind auto attackers. It lasts 1.75 seconds, which means it lasts longer than Johanna's Shield Glare. And it's very valuable against heroes like Tychus. So you want to wait to see the trait. For example, when he pops minigun, the gun glows. So you want to try and look out for anything with a tell. And anyone who's going to be hitting you a lot. For example, for Vala, you either want to hit them with the Snowball usually immediately or once they have already gotten up their hatred a bit. But anytime there's a tell with a certain auto attacker, that's what you want to do. And the other thing that people don't tend to use Snowball for, or Snowblind, see I'm doing it now, you can use it to set up other abilities. It has a 35% slow attached. And while that's not the biggest in the world, that's pretty significant in terms of being able to dodge things without using a mobility. So if an enemy hero doesn't have a mobility button up, you can generally just throw Snowblind at them, and then any follow-up from your other heroes is going to hit, as long as they know and react quickly to follow it up. Same thing for following up your own abilities. If you slow someone with Snowblind and then drop a Blizzard around their head, they're not going to be able to get away, because once the stun on the slow on Blizzard stacks up fully, they'll be like they were permanently 35% slowed until they get stunned. And speaking of Blizzard, that's your W button. And that is the primary annoyance with Mei, because you can cover an entire point. For example, Braxis, it covers... if you drop it directly on the middle, I think there's a tiny little corner you can stand on without getting frozen. Same thing if you try and take camps. If you throw it directly in the middle, you essentially cover the entire point. The radius is quite large. The other thing is, it's very easy to miss time if you're trying to walk through it. So if you get out on the other end and then you try to walk back in the direction you came because you think it's over, if you mistime it, you will get frozen in. And you'll hear a lot of people complain, oh, I stuck my toe in there. And it does not matter how long you were in the blizzard. If you step in on the last tick of it, you will get stunned. That is when the stun goes off. Also, the slow scales over time. It adds, what was it? Yeah, there you go. It takes over half a second for the full slow to kick in. And so that's something also to keep in mind. If you drop it directly on someone who is already moving, what that means is they won't start to be slowed until the initial cast is done. And what usually happens is they'll be slowed toward the end of the blizzard, but they'll already be out of it. You're never going to stun someone just walking in a straight line if you just try and drop it on them exactly as they were while they're walking. Unless, again, you've slowed them initially already. And again, you're mostly using this to either zone people out of points or keep them locked into a certain area. Essentially, you can use it to deny area. I like to do it. Because even if they never enter the blizzard themselves, that means you've cut off that entire radius from them. They cannot step there, or they won't step there. So knowing you can't be attacked from like that portion of the battlefield makes it a lot easier to conduct fights or like funnel people through choke points, stuff like that. You don't always have to get direct value like damage and slows from Mei's abilities for her to control how a fight is going to play out. You can use it to dictate where enemies have to fight and how they have to fight. There's a little mention here of the blizzard icing. We're going to talk about that more in just a couple of minutes. So for icing, that's your E. It's your primary mobility tool. It's an unconditional engage and escape. And by unconditional, I mean you hit the button, and then you, after a quarter of a second of startup, I believe it is, you will go ahead and fire it up, and you will be in your E animation. And so what happens after you end up in your E animation, you will either slide to where you are, or it'll get interrupted, in which case the knockback will happen. And more importantly, on 7, if you take skating away, you get 20% movement speed and 50 physical armor. So even if you're trying to use icing to escape and it gets interrupted, odds are what's going to happen is the knockback's going to knock back anyone scary standing around you that might be falling up. And then with your increased movement speed and armor, you're going to run out of the situation and get away. And it's relatively consistent. Like, I'm very surprised at how hard it is to lock down a Mei for an extended period of time. Even without the ability, but with skating away, it's incredibly difficult. Same thing if you hold your trait for when you're trying to run away. Generally, Mei players die because they icing in and overstay in a fight. And what happens is they die before they get their next set of cooldowns off. Later on, you'll get cooling servos if you go that talent, which makes it significantly easier to go in and get out of fights. But in general, icing, the biggest mistake you can be making is just using it always to go in, or always using it with Blizzard. It is a very good tool on its own. Because again, you can go ahead and use it to get into the middle of heroes. And if you take Cold Front and Black Ice, for example, you can do that. Because you'll get refunded cooldown time on your icing. And Black Ice makes it so your 80% slow doesn't decay. And by the way, if you didn't know, if you hit someone directly with the icing, that's an 80% slow that decays over time. But at 16 with Black Ice, it's just basically a root. It's the same if you walk up as Johanna and hit someone with the Subdue quest done. You're essentially rooting them in place, even though they can move a little bit. Which is why Black Ice is generally the preferred 16 at the moment. If you don't have Cold Front, you gotta remember icing has a pretty long cooldown attached. So again, don't spam it. If you do have Cold Front, you can spam it, but I really hate the lessons you're gonna learn from it. So once you get good at Mei, I really recommend trying out Cold Front and getting used to being aggressive with it. But in general, just save icing if you can. As an example of how survivable you are when you do have all your buttons up, here's a clip from, I think, 1.5 seasons ago in Heroes Lounge Files, or last season Hero Files. I think this is a good example.
That's like really going to change things in their favor here. What ray of hope they still have, aside from just straight up taking these fights and winning them straight up.
There's no icing left whatsoever. Definitely
Yeah,
having troubles on the Mei.
The Crier Freeze buys a few seconds, the Ice Wall as well. Icing?
Oh, wait.
Oh my
yes.
god.
Up back.
Reggie's outside their level 10s, that's like...
And so you can kind of see from the Twitch clip there, I had spread out my buttons, and so I always had one to annoy them. Obviously, I still should have died in that particular spot. You should never be able to get out of there. But because I used my buttons effectively, I managed to have enough time to get a new icing and get out with basically no life left. And it's just a good example of like what happens when you spread your buttons out and understand all of them can buy you time in a fight. So it's not good to just spam them all off cooldown. Besides that, we want to talk about the Blizzard Icing combo, which is your primary engage. You generally want to throw it on someone standing still or already slowed if you want to make sure the Blizzard will land. The other reason to do that is because that means if you icing, you can focus more on like people who have mobility options. For example, Tychus, if he's going to dash out, you can generally have a little more time to line up where you think they're going to dash to and E towards them to try and knock them back in. And so something else to keep in mind, this is going to work like I'd say like 80% of the time in Storm League. In actual coordinated games, this is not going to work nearly as often. People will walk in better directions. I actually have more problems landing this in quick match than anything else because people walk in such random directions that I don't expect them to. And half the time this ends up getting them frozen in the Blizzard anyway. But it turns out it's really hard to E in the direction if you have just actual no idea where they're going to walk to. And so this is an example of where someone's leading with Blizzard. You can see they're running away from the 3 heroes here. And more than likely they're going to die. But we want to make sure that so the Blizzard is dropped in such a way that's cutting them off. You notice we're not trying to drop it directly on them or the Lucia. We just want to make sure they can't walk in this direction anymore. Or if they do, they'll continue to be slowed. You can see I've highlighted in pink this outline here. So you have a better idea of what the actual radius is. And again, like I was saying before, it's quite significant. You can see the Brightwing polymorph Q here. And you can see how much bigger the radius of Blizzard is. And so from here, because you've essentially got 2 people trapped and they can only go 2 directions, it makes it much easier to decide where you want to E, if you want to E at all in this situation. This is another example. It's a little messier, but you can see tremors on Mei, and he's actually mid-slide right now. He dropped a Blizzard directly on Lobber and Ultralisk, and so this is those two walking out just naturally. And so what it means is Tremor can very easily just slide directly in front of both, and what will likely happen is he will accidentally bump the Ana out, because she'll get bumped upward and not slightly back and to the left. But Lobber is going to 100% get it. In this situation, also, he didn't have E. So because the Mei player knows that, they can safely do it. Otherwise, they would more than likely focus on trying to knock the Ana back. As, again, Ana doesn't have a relevant escape in this situation. So this is just an example of, like, how you're going to drop your AoE, and then decide where you're going to icing into to try and knock back either the maximum amount of people or someone specific that you know can't escape as long as you land the knockback. And this is another final example where you can just see the outline of the Blizzard starting up. And so what's going to happen here is this Imperius is going to be stuck, and Stukov's also going to be starting to caught in it and start to get slowed. I am going to just E forward because I want to ensure the Imperius doesn't get out. I'm less interested in trying to make sure the Stukov can't. And the reason for this is because if I slide downward and pop it a little early, I can hit the Imperius even if he spears to the right. Whereas if I go after the Stukov and they spear directly down, they can actually still get out of this Blizzard. The other relevant button you have, obviously, is your Cryo Freeze, which is your trait. And for anyone who didn't know, the full one is it's a shield that grants Unstoppable and restores up to 35% of your life. And the shield itself will absorb up to 1100 damage. And so most of the time, this button gets used as a, oh shit, I'm going to die. And so they pop their trait to survive. What you should be doing over time is using it as a short cleanse or an Unstoppable. Again, you can do this to a lot of other tank abilities. Shadow Charge, Stab, Slide, etc. Like, if you can get the timing down and know when those abilities are going to be used, they're not too hard to just be stopped immediately. And then not only have you taken a very important cooldown away from the other tank for the cost of a trait, they're stuck in melee range of you, which is usually pretty good if you want to just make sure the tank is stuck in one spot for your team to kill. The other thing you can do is, like, I use Dragonair off Hanzo as the most obvious example. If you know it's coming, you can stand in such a way to tank it for the team. And again, if you time it right, you just pop your trait, you eat the arrow, you come out of the shield, and you've completely negated that heroic, and you didn't even have to eat the full stun time to do it. So you can immediately go back to helping your team. The other reason the trait is good is because of Crystallize, which won't always be taken. There's actually multiple talents on that tier you can take. But if you do, you have spell armor off it. And so you can treat it essentially like Muradin when they jump in and use Avatar to soak up more buttons. You get 40 spell armor during the activation. Like, the whole time the shield's up, you have 40 spell armor, and it lasts 1 second after the shield breaks. And it does not matter how the shield breaks. Either the full duration runs out, you cancel it, or it gets broken by enemy attacks. You will still have that 40 spell armor for 1 second after it goes away. So, people are going to primarily punish you because it means you can't move. And obviously, if you try and icing immediately out of it, any sort of interrupt will still leave you in the same spot you were. Again, if you took Skein away, you're going to have a little movement boost, but later in the game where you can get killed pretty quickly, that's not going to matter nearly as much as it is early in the game. And so what you want to do, again, is not make it really obvious that, hey, I'm at 20% life and I need to pop this trait now or I'm going to die. You want to try and get used to using it around like 50 to 70% of your life and use it as a, as a top up kind of thing. And obviously you'll know the more you play with Mei when it's good to, use the ability in between your set of buttons. The other reason is cooling servos, where all your cooldowns will come off quicker. They'll recharge faster. And so obviously if you go that talent, you're encouraged to trait after using most of your buttons, if not all of them, so that way you can get a second round of them really quickly. And then the final thing is, again, suck up skill shots, especially if you go crystallize. You can stand in like a choke point and tank like all of Li Ming or Hanzo or Chromie Qs and stuff like that, and it'll basically do almost no damage to you. This is really relevant on, say, BOE, where someone could be shelling your Immortal out of vision. And as a tank, if you have life, your job is basically to absorb that damage for your Immortal. And turns out, having 40 spell arm makes it really easy. Your heroics are Ice Wall versus Avalanche. You can read what's on the screen, but for the most part, I'm just going to tell you pick Ice Wall. It's got such a low cooldown now that it's not quite trolling to take Avalanche. Avalanche is still a very good heroic. But the problem is with 50 seconds, you basically always have Ice Wall. And so in competitive, that means you can always look for picks. And if you don't get them, you're going to have it back so quickly before another team fight breaks out. It's really hard to say, oh yeah, take Avalanche. Take the one that's like you may not have in time for an objective. Or you went for a pick and you didn't get it, and now you have to wait a significant amount of time. Ice Wall comes off cooldown quicker than Bless Shield, and that's the usual go-to for that example. You have to take the 20 upgrade for Avalanche to get that same kind of cooldown reduction. Although I will say, if you do Avalanche and you get the 20 upgrade, it is ridiculously powerful if you land it. It takes the damage output from that from your heroic to like 400 to 500 damage and raise it to about 1 to 1.5k damage. And because the snowball RNG, if you have a big hitbox, there's a video out there floating about of the best North American Phoenix player getting hit by it and dying because the Phoenix hitbox is so big and the snowballs all landed basically in that hitbox at the end. And he took over 2k damage from that. Over 2,000 damage just from this single ability, which is just ridiculous. So it's very easy to kill people with Avalanche if you can set it up. The main problem with Avalanche is you can't set it up on your own without spending all of your buttons. And again, in competitive play, it's really easy to know it's coming to just save a cleanse for it, in which case you just watch the snowball roll through them, and it's very, very sad. Again, if you take Ice Wall, couple odds and ends, there's a 3/4 of a second delay to Ice Wall popping up. This means for the little notification, ideally you want to do it out of vision so nobody knows it's coming. Otherwise, if you can't, what you want to do is try and do it in such a way that it forces people to walk either the direction you want or force them against a wall so they can't move anyway. One of the worst things as another tank player is if you dodge the Ice Wall on, say, a boss invade or a camp invade, and you get stuck against the wall, and then you can't move anyway. You're just jammed against it. So essentially it's done its job, and you don't have the protection of the being in stasis. So sometimes it can actually work out worse for you not being in the stasis if you're stuck in a choke point. And that's the kind of call, if you're on the, if you're on the wrong end of it, you have to decide, what's more likely? Am I going to die if I get Ice Walled, or am I going to die if I don't get in the Ice Wall? It's kind of like Void Prison if you were playing when Zeratul was everywhere. Again, as an Ice Wall, you want to angle it diagonally, just in general, because it makes it harder for people to move their hitboxes out of the way. It's very similar to Blizzard, where you might stick a toe in it, not realize it, and then get frozen in stasis. You can't drop Ice Wall early. I don't know why people think you can, but you can't. So once it's up, it's up. You can see here the initial outline, and then I kind of drew it on its own just so you can kind of get a feel for it besides. And so this is kind of, you can see Ice Wall takes up a significant chunk of the screen. And if you were to lay it, say, here along this line, you could block off this entire corridor. And so that's just a good example of like why Ice Wall is really obnoxious to deal with and why you should be taking it, because you can really limit enemies' movement without even trying. This is what Ice Wall looks like when it's fully up. And again, this is terrain, so you cannot bypass it without having the ability to do so. It also messes up pathfinding really badly if you're trying to walk around it. That's something to keep in mind if you're trying to set something up on your own team. Don't click past the wall. It confuses the hell out of it, and you'll be walking in a random direction. Weaknesses of Mei. Right now, Mei is among the highest win rate heroes in the game, and that's because she's basically like pre-nerf Johanna. She has very few weaknesses, and the ones that are available are generally only going to happen in really high-level games or coordinated games. So the main reason Mei wasn't seeing play at first is because she doesn't have a consistent engage. What's going to happen is you have this, again, Blizzard plus Icing or Slow plus Icing, where you can set up your WE and then Ice Wall itself. And so while these aren't super consistent because you can maneuver around them, you can cleanse people out of them, something to keep in mind is later in the game, you don't need to apply like heroics in it, your WE, to get the full value. If you have Black Ice, again, it's an 80% slow. If you have good follow-up, and you should be able to kill someone with an 80% slow on them, like if a squishy's out of position, no problem. It's just, they're not going to get away. But that is probably the most like repeated, oh, Mei is not good because of this reason I hear. And it's just something you just work around. She doesn't have the best engage. She doesn't have point and click like a Shadow Charge. She doesn't have a Blessed Shield. She doesn't have the best tank engages, but she has good engages. So you just got to make use of them. And your team has to be used to following up on slows and not like hard CC. The other reason, again, we talked about earlier, your trade is very telegraphed if you want it to be. You basically have to pop it if you're about to die. Turns out that makes anti-heal really good. If someone can slide a Stukov silence under you, that's really good. This is also why aggressive icing is really tough sometimes. Because if you get CC'd and then Stukov just sticks a silence under you, all those survivability options are gone. They're out the window. And so you can die stuck in a silence pool and not being able to walk out in time. So again, that's not something you'll normally see in like Storm League games, but it's pretty common in higher level games. Varian in the tank versus tank matchup actually is really obnoxious. Not only because taunt breaks a lot of what you want to do, but also because his 13 is really annoying. Either he takes a 40% anti-heal on charge, which again makes heat transfer worse, makes your trait worse, makes your healer worse, etc. Or he takes shield break, which means your trait gets blown up immediately. I actually am happier when my trait gets blown up immediately, just because, again, you get the spell armor no matter what. So that will hopefully let you survive a little longer. But if you don't take Crystallize and you get your trait broken, you're almost assuredly dead. And it's still not something you want to play around if you can avoid it. So a lot of times if you see a tank blow up comp, it's going to involve Varian or Stukov or both. And they are really make your life miserable. Also, Deckard Emerald, same deal. Has a bit of a startup, so it's not quite as bad as the other two, but they can still make your life really miserable. Also, just a little note at the bottom, like it says there, if you self-cast Blizzard before the taunt goes off, he's going to get stuck in it. And so that is, hopefully your team can follow up and, like, at worst you trade with the Varian. but ideally you just get out. The other weakness is you're not a very scary tank to walk past. So once people know what your abilities do, they can just walk by you. That's why I talked about auto attacks are really important to demount people. If you let people run mounted towards you and they start to get by you, you don't really have any good way to stop them. Your best way is, again, just body block them. That's something not enough people do in general, but you can slow them and body block them. Or you can use important buttons to try and stop them, which ideally you don't want to do, because not only is it really obvious when you have to do that, it's usually means you're going to split yourself off from your team. So ideally, if you're going to use a Blizzard Ice Wall on someone aggressive, you use it to split them off from their team. In other words, you're not doing it to peel for them. You're doing it so your team can turn around and beat up the frontliner that was like, I'm going to go and wreck your backline. And hopefully you win your 1v4, 1v5, or whatever. I talked about this in my Diablo one, so if this looks familiar, it's the exact same slide. If you're going to engage on people, this is what you want to be looking for. You want to look at what a good engage is from the point of view of not only you and your team. In other words, can your DPS follow up on what you're trying to do? But also, is it good in the context of what does the enemy have to stop me? This is why I talked about icing. If you're, WE in on somebody with no mobility that's out of position, their healer can't do anything, that's completely different from just WEing on the tank and the enemy has drafted, Stukov or something to mess you up, or something like a Tychus who can shred you for, stepping up really aggressively. Things like that. So you want to look at both sides of it. And again, you don't have to play Mei like an engaged tank, which is why I think she's so popular in general, besides slightly being overtuned. It's just, you can kind of do whatever you want with her. You can play her as a very generalist tank, as long as, again, you take advantage of your buttons and slows. So I always tell Mei players to save buttons. As long as you have a button up, not only is your own survivability much higher, but the odds that you can do something to, let your team win a fight goes up dramatically. The worst thing you can do is use all three of your main buttons in the first 2 seconds of a fight, which I see way too often. And then everyone knows you're basically useless except for some auto attacks for the next 10 to 12 seconds of the fight, essentially. Again, unless you pop trait and use cooling servos to get those back faster. So as long as you even have one button, you can perhaps force someone to walk out of an area that was attacking your squishy, immobile healer. Or you can force the tank to walk in a certain direction that they can't apply their CC chain anymore. Stuff like that. General tank communications, I'm looking at this. You're not charging anyone, you're using icing, you're not flipping anyone, you're dropping Blizzard. But you do have to communicate Ice Wall really well. The most hilarious Ice Walls you'll ever get are when you accidentally split your own team when you're fighting a choke point, and you try and drop Ice Wall immediately, and you accidentally put in an angle you don't want, and split up the team because they weren't expecting that. General talent choices. You can see for yourself what these are. I'm not going to bore you and explain what these talents are. I assume anyone watching this or listening to this knows what Mei talents are and why you would pick them in a given situation. The one thing I want to talk about besides that is don't go Q build. Q build's just mathematically trash. The talents aren't good. Most of her talents are at least pickable in a given situation. The one you'll see most often in really aggressive builds tend to be Heat Transfer, Cold Front, Scaling Away, Polar Vortex, Black Ice. Again, for heroics, I would say you're always going with Ice Wall for now until something changes. Either they make the cooldown longer or they buff Avalanche in some other way. Flash freeze is essentially shit, except when you're getting killed. If the enemy team, again, their only play is blowing you up, and they're doing that consistently, take flash freeze. Because at that point, you surviving is more important than everything else you might get value out of. Otherwise, take your alt upgrade. If you did take Avalanche, you 100% take Cascade, because that just makes that heroic much, much, much better. Shatter is more of a nice thing, because, again, you're probably going to be using it as a wall as much as you are like landing it on people as a stasis. If you have a way to set up your ice wall, like say Entomb or something, so you can consistently land it, then it's a little different, because 25 anti-armor plus some damage on top is really good. So Shatter gets a lot better in that case. And the big one, which I don't think people actually have ever picked or read or understand like why it's good. And so I'm going to skip ahead for 1 second. This is what the big one is. You can see the radius there on that. You essentially cover the same size as a cap point, or even slightly bigger. It does 460 damage to anyone you hit at level 20 as soon as you pick it. An untalented Tychus grenade at 20 is 540 damage. So you have a slightly less damaging Tychus grenade that has a huge AoE splash that applies a blind for 1.75 seconds and a 30% slow. So when you say it like that, it looks a lot better than what it sounds like when you just read the talent for the first time. And if you've never picked it, the radius otherwise is like slightly in the middle of all four of those, but you're never going to hit everybody. So if you run into a clump, like if, say, triple melee or triple frontliner, or someone where it's like double auto attacker, then suddenly the big one looks a lot better, because you can take like 10% of their life and hit everyone and annoy the hell out of them. These are the other... Sorry, go ahead.
Is it okay to ask a question? Right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what's wrong with heavy pack at 1, though? If you are up against, say, like, a double AA.
Well, so if you're against double AA, I would say the 16, which gives you a second Q, is actually pickable. Like against a Zul'jin, for example, I would say it's fine. The problem with picking heavy pack against AA heroes is it's only increasing the duration of the slow. And the problem with... it encourages you to use your Blizzard aggressively when you may not want it, because that's how you're going to get your cooldown back faster for your Q. Because heavy pack doesn't trigger off like auto... If it triggered off like auto attacks or something, where you could trade and get Q back faster while they're blind, for example, that's not as bad. But essentially it encourages you to use Blizzard hyper aggressively to get Q cooldown back. And it doesn't increase the blind time, so you're not actually getting that much value out of it on auto attackers, which is generally the time you would be taking Q talents.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so if anyone has any other questions about any of her other talents, as I said, she's pretty flexible. I would say most of her talents are pickable. The ones that I don't think are really pickable are Heavy Pack, Slush Ball, whatchamacallit, Induced Hibernation has a decent win rate, but I don't understand like when you would ever use it in a real game. So I kind of just think that's generic. But otherwise, I think pretty much every other talent she has is pickable in a given situation. Like, okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
With Ice Wall, do you think it's better to pull it towards you or push it away from you to try to capture people? Or obviously situations will
right. So it's mostly going to depend on like how aggressively you're looking. If you're just trying to get one person that's kind of out of position maybe or isolated, you probably want to pull it back towards you. Same thing if you're using Ice Wall to retreat versus, aggroing at somebody. But if you're trying to just get at somebody, land it like diagonally, like at a 45-degree angle, across from them. So that way, even if you don't land them in the initial stasis, you at least make it so they can only walk in one or two directions.
Yeah, so you're locking them in with you.
Yeah, exactly. Like, ideally, ice wall, people will remember it's a wall. Like, sometimes I put it in such a way that I will never hit anyone with it, but as long as I keep them from running away, I know we're going to win the fight we're about to take.
One thing that, like, I had kind of realized, and I'd be interested to hear your take, is, like, trying not to use it in the middle of a fight necessarily, and, like, trying to open the team fight with it rather than casting it where you might interrupt or, like, have anti-synergy.
Yeah, so for sure. Ideally, again, you're trying to use Ice Wall at the beginning. I mean, hopefully out of vision even, but if you can't do that, then ideally at the beginning of the fight, because it will hopefully give you an advantage in positioning. And again, the problem with using it in the middle of the fight, not only does it take time to set up, because most of the time you're going to be using on release, and it's vector targeting, so it's going to take you a couple of moments to, correctly place it. Because if you just slam it down, then yeah, like you were saying, you potentially can mess up the fight positioning for your own team, especially if they're not ready for it. Like, if you just throw out Ice Wall in the middle of a fight, odds are you probably also didn't say anything, so they're not expecting this terrain to be there, and it might mess something up.
So if you do it out of sight, does that give them, like, no indicator? The enemies?
The indicator still shows up, but there's no sound. They just see the indicator. And so what happens is most people on ping aren't going to be able to react in time.
That's actually something I never thought about. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. It is something where, with that kind of notification, it's about enough time that you can consistently move out of its way if you think it's coming. But if you're not expecting it, it's quite hard to, like, actually move out of the way, especially if you're not mounted, for example. If you're mounted, then it's not too bad at all, honestly. So, I kind of just fell on this next slide just because I always recommend heat transfer, because not only does it increase your heal output, but it increases your base DPS damage to basically a real hero. So again, the base here, 78, goes to 104 damage when heat transfer is in effect. That is the same damage output as a Falstad or a Raynor. And again, you're a tank, and you have ranged autos. That is something no other tank can do. And so heat transfer essentially in the early game lets you trade like a normal DPS hero, except you have, like, essentially twice as much health, which is ridiculous. So if you ever run into, like, a squishy that wants to fight you 1v1, and you can consistently land your snowblind on them, go ahead and fight them. You probably come out on top, and you don't even have to necessarily use well to recover, whereas they will, or they'll have to back, because you can trade up and get your heals back. Just general tips and tricks. Icing knockback triggers as soon as it's canceled. This includes being interrupted. If you slide into a mosh pit, you will always break the mosh. The knockback is far enough. If you get shadow charged or flipped, the knockback will go off instantly and knock him away from you, which means that ability will go on full cooldown, and you will not be stunned. Essentially, anything that will micro-stun you, it will trigger the knockback. Same thing if, like, Johanna's in the middle of a condemn, and you want to knock back, say, the rest of her team, go ahead and start up E, and as soon as it goes off, it'll pop it, and you'll get the knockback. And again, if you take scanning away, that's an easy way to get armor. If you know that's coming and you need the armor and the movement speed, go ahead and do it. Snowblind, again, most people use that at the start of a fight. It's really good at the end of a fight, because if you hit anyone with it, you'll almost inevitably be able to run them down, especially if you and the enemy were both on foot and your DPS player took the time to mount up. They're going to easily catch up to them and then kill them. If you start a blizzard out of vision, either behind a bush or in a bush, they won't see the initial cast until the damage starts triggering. And so once that happens, by the time they know what's happening, usually it's too late. Even if they turn around, try and walk out of it, they'll get stunned. Something to note with common talent is Acclamation. You only get 10 armor on max stacks, which is 20. And so the talent's not nearly as good as people think it is, unless you're consistently getting stacked, which means slowing people a lot, which means usually you can't take this talent without Polar Vortex. It is perfectly fine if you plan on being in the middle of people and Polar Vortex is good, and you're triggering it. 10 armor is really good along with the other benefits, but if you're not consistently getting it, I would say really look hard at the other options, because Fresh Powder is really good in very niche comps, and obviously Black Ice is just incredible. So, this is a Mei video I made for common tips and tricks. You can see what these are here, and it's from a scrim. I'm going to put that in the resource section after I'm done with this presentation. So if you want to look at that, it's about 10 minutes long, and it will go over that in a real game. So if you're interested, that will be there. These are general tank notes. Again, if you've seen my Diablo stuff, it's all the same. You want to body block people, you should be mounting up all the time. You ideally only want to fight people when you have an edge. And you're going to be spending most of the late game in coordinated play, sitting in bushes, being bored, and looking for a spot to attack the enemy from. So that is essentially the end of this fun little presentation. I hope you learned something from it. Now is like, if anyone has questions about anything I missed or didn't cover, now is a great time to do so.
Just a question on Ice Wall. Does it act as terrain for Diablo Q and Hanzo scatters?
You can charge people into Ice Wall, yes. It acts as normal terrain.
Same as with Tassadar Wall or even Nazeebo Zombie Wall.
Yeah, essentially, like, close enough.
Yeah.
One other random minor note about Ice Wall. When it goes off, wherever you place the base will actually go off first, and anyone caught in it actually ends up in stasis a little longer, because the timer for the Ice Wall breaking does not start until all of the Ice Wall has formed on the screen. Just a random little note that will probably never come up, like, intentionally, but just something, if you ever wonder, like, why you were trapped in Ice Wall seemingly longer than another time, that's probably why.
I found out something interesting the other day with Ice Wall. If D.Va's out of her mech and it's like she's got it self-destruct going, I don't think it stasis it. It won't. It'll just push it out. They tried to save my team by stasising the blowing up mech, and it didn't work.
Okay.
A hilarious interaction with Ming's teleport a couple weeks ago too. I was teleporting right when the Ice Wall went down, so I ended up frozen in stasis outside of the Ice Wall.
Yeah, so stasis can affect things in kind of odd ways. One fun example that came up in a real game just the other day, someone caught the protector as it was spawning in the falling animation with Ice Wall, and it just freezes it in midair.
Awesome.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, that's what happened when I was playing Ming.
Also of note, if you ever put an Ice Wall on your... essentially layer it over yourself, where your hitbox is, and, like, immediately pop trait, you will get shoved to whatever, you know, the closest border is of the Ice Wall, essentially, and that'll determine whether you get pushed on the top side of it or bottom side of it. So yeah, if you put Ice Wall through your own hitbox, it just shoves you to whichever side's closer. Any other questions?
So you ice wall an ETC while he's moshing. Does the mosh continue afterwards? It does, right?
It puts them in stasis, which means, yeah, if they were in the middle of something like that, it will continue. Same thing applies to, say, Diablo Lightning Breath, where he's unstoppable. You can freeze him. He goes in stasis in the middle of his animation, and he'll still be doing that once it breaks.
Okay.
It will stop enemies channeling, though, which is kind of an oddity. But yeah, if they're in the middle of the channel animation, they'll be put in stasis, and then they will break the channel when they pop out.
So you can use it to cancel, say, Pyroblast.
No. I meant, like, so if they're channeling, like, a tribute or something in the middle of that animation, like, or an objective, and you put them in Ice Wall, it will look like they're still in the animation. Like, the timer will stop on the middle of it, for example, but when it breaks, it will reset the channel for them.
Gotcha.
And so, yeah, that was it for the presentation. Thanks all for listening or watching. This will end up on YouTube later and be posted in the resource section. So if anyone has anything they want to go back to or any of the other stuff, that'll be in the resource section later.
Cool, thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem.